I would like right now to call up Howard Brown, who's our government liaison consultant, and he's with the firm Brown & Cohen, and Howard is going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Kim, for your leadership at PEO and in the Ontario Centre for Engineering and Public Policy. It's a great honor and a privilege for me to introduce our next speaker. Don Newman and I served together on the board of the Canadian Club of Toronto, and when he joined the board about a year ago, I just was thrilled to work with him. And when he accepted our invitation to speak today on getting the engineer's message across to the public and the government, I thought we were in for a real treat. But who would have thought when we invited him that we'd be doing it on the heels, literally days, of one of the most exciting federal elections in Canadian history. And literally, in the coming weeks, we're going to be having a provincial election. What could be more timely? And especially to have Don do what the minister just spoke about of explaining the world to Canadians. What an opportunity. Don Newman is a senior strategic advisor with the Bluesky strategy group here in Ottawa, and he's chair of the advisory board of an organization called Canada 2020. He is one of the country's most respected journalists and broadcasters, and his celebrated career, it's hard to imagine, spans over 40 years. He's a member of the Order of Canada, as is Dr. Patry. He's a life member of the Canadian Parliamentary Press Gallery. He's received numerous awards, including a Gemini Lifetime Achievement Award in Public Affairs Broadcasting. He was a senior parliamentary editor for CBC Television News, and you've seen him many times anchoring the election nights across Canada for many years. But he also did specials. He did This Week in Parliament, Politics with Don Newman. He helped launch CBC's All News channel in 1989, the first of its kind in Canada. He's now a columnist with something called iPOLITICS.ca, and it's a publication that comes out every day, an e-blast that I get every day, and you can subscribe for its terrific publication. He's a media commentator. He's a public speaker, very well, much sought after. He's in the boards of a number of organizations, the Canada's National History Society, the Science Media Centre of Canada, the Canadian Committee for World Press Freedom, and the advisory board of the Canadian International Council's Foreign Policy Initiative. He's also chair of the nominating committee of the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. He's chair of the jury for the 2010 Canadian Foreign Service Awards, and he's also served as a judge of Canada's National Newspaper and Charles Lynch Awards. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a real privilege to welcome a distinguished Canadian, a great friend. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Don Newman to our stage. Great to have you here.
Well, first let me thank Howard for that fulsome introduction. You might have thought it was a little long. I actually thought it was a little long. But I asked Howard to do that because when I spent 33 years at the CBC, and when I left the CBC, and I was out doing other things, but I was being introduced at speeches, I didn't really worry too much about what the introduction was going to be like until the fourth time I was out speaking, and I was in Winnipeg, and the introduction was pretty brief. The woman who was giving it said, "Well, now we're on to our next speaker. Please welcome to our microphone the man who used to be Don Newman." So that's why you had to go through that long and tortuous introduction from Howard. But thank you, Howard. It was terrific, and you read it just the way I wrote it. So I want to thank you for that too.
With some changes.
I feel rather guilty about coming up here now because I was so interested in the panel before, and I know there were questions still to be asked and answered. One of the things, though, when you're not the first speaker, is you can, in some ways, comment on what you've heard before. I feel a bit of pressure. The previous speakers Already some of their remarks have gone viral. They've been tweeted, and now they're being retweeted, and that's a pretty high standard when you're a speaker, to follow people whose remarks, before they're out of their mouth, or barely out of their mouth, are on the internet and going around the world. And so I'm not sure I can do anything on that level to help you. But I did want to comment on a couple of things, and Minister Murray said something nice about me, but I know you're looking forward to having a meeting with him. And what I can tell you about dealing with him, because as Howard said, I'm on the board, the founding board of the Science Media Centre of Canada, and that was created in 2009, and some of us decided to go on the board because two things are happening. There's an explosion and probably has been all along, but most of us, certainly in my career, weren't really paying much attention about it. Probably since the space program in the 1960s and 70s, tremendous amount of scientific information always coming to the fore. And by and large, journalists, there were a few science specialists in journalism, but most journalists didn't know too much about it. Well, what has happened in the media with the contracting advertising markets and the plethora of competition and the internet taking away a lot of readers and viewers, there aren't the same kind of specialist reporters in big news organizations that there were in the past. When I worked at the CBC in the 1980s, we had a legal specialist, we had a medical specialist, we had a science specialist, we had an environmental specialist. None of those jobs exist anymore at the CBC, and they don't in many other places as well. So what we decided we better do is create a center where reporters who were on the general beat but would be assigned to important scientific stories from time to time would have a resource where they could go and find out information from experts on whatever relevant matter they were discussing. So we've created basically a panel of experts from all across Canada, mainly in universities, but also in corporations, who are experts on various different fields. And if I'm reporting from the Ottawa Citizen and I'm suddenly, it can be a natural disaster, it can be a scientific breakthrough, it can be a medical inquiry. Say it's the tsunami. I can phone the Science Media Centre and say, I need to talk to somebody who knows all about tsunamis, but not just tsunamis, ones that actually have hit Japan before, never mind other tsunamis. I'm not interested in that. And through the Science Media Centre, you will be put in touch with, I'll be put in touch with as a reporter, an expert somewhere in Canada who's already agreed that they'll be available for this kind of comment. And we hope that by doing that, we will be able to create at least accurate information in the media on major different scientific events as they evolve. So I would recommend to the Ontario Centre for Engineering and Public Policy that you get in touch with the Science Media Centre of Canada and either offer yourselves or offer colleagues that you know are experts and add to that body of information that is available when journalists call. Now, beyond that, we also have what we call webinars, which is we put out to particularly people. I mean, it's difficult to find people unless they contact you, although we do it to media organizations. We said, we're going to have a webinar. You log on in a certain time, and it's a seminar on the internet on one topic or another, and so those are pretty well taken up as well. But certainly, and I'm telling you about Minister Murray in this regard, when we were looking for funding, one of the people we decided we should approach is him, because that's his ministry, and he was very supportive. First, he was very supportive in terms of having meetings and understanding what we were doing, and when we explained it to him, he was also supportive in terms of backing. So he is certainly a man, when he tells you he wants you to get in touch with him and he's interested in what you're doing, make sure you take him up on that, because he certainly is interested, and if you can make a good case, he'll be supportive as well. Now, I wanted also to comment on one other question, which I think was the first question that came, and I think maybe even from you. And the question was, where's the next C.D. Howe? Was that your question? Yes. Where is the next C.D. Howe? And you remember C.D. Howe was the Minister of Everything, and he brought in the $1-a-year men during the war, and at least I'm told, I know I'm old, but I don't actually remember that. But the fact is, there probably isn't another C.D. Howe. I would not know this for sure, but I know it intuitively, and I bet you know it as well. If we went through the list of people, the 308 people that were elected on Monday night to sit in the House of Commons, How many engineers do you think we would find on that list? Four. 4 out of 308. That is not a very good representation, I would say, of a very important profession, which is, as Dr. Patry was pointing out, has the training to identify problems, to consider various solutions for them, and then work out a work schedule and plan for moving along to solve those problems. If you can't resolve them, at least you can deal with them. And I would think that for a profession that has that kind of a skill set, that would be very much required in terms of government, in terms of public policy. And so I compliment you on the Ontario Centre for Engineering and Public Policy, but I think, and I know it's only been going a few years, but I think that is just the beginning. But I would say this to you, as Woody Allen once said, a great philosopher, 75% of life is showing up. And in terms of starting the centre, you've at least shown up. And that's a good idea. You're there. And the other 25%, I think Woody had it a little wrong. I think once you've shown up, there's another 100% you have to deal with. And 20% of that is deciding why you showed up and what you want to do when you get there. And the other 80% of that is communicating it and convincing other people that what you want to do and what you think should be done is worth doing, and getting the buy-in from them to do it. So I think that when you think about what you want to do, and there's lots of things to do, and I think you're going to find there's a lot of things to do. I think, you know, they say there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I don't in any way question the importance of innovation, but I do question in some ways the statistic of economic growth. And I know that, and I go to a lot of these innovation conferences, and this always comes up. Well, in the 50s and into the 60s, there was this 4% growth, and now it's tailed off and so forth. Well, two things happened. As economies become larger and more mature, you can actually have, in terms of real dollar economic growth, a higher amount than you did, say, 20 years before, but as a percentage of the economy, it's smaller. So in terms of percentages, you have to be careful. But the other thing is, and this is important to your profession, if you think or you read about, or someone told you about, the 50s and into the 60s, and even to maybe the beginning of the 70s, much of the infrastructure, much of what is modern-day Canada, much of the facilities we have, whether it's the power grid, whether it's hydro dams, whether it's university buildings, much of what was built and created modern Canada was done in those years, and that created a lot of economic growth. Now we're at a point where, by and large, that is having to be renewed. And not just the infrastructure, the bridges and the roads, the highway system, the whole electrical system, the whole electrical grid. I saw a study the other day that said, now it came from the electricity industry, so they may have had some vested interest in it, but they were predicting that over the next 20 years, it'll take $20 billion of reinvestment into the power grid, the generation and distribution in Canada. So that's $1 billion a year over the next 20 years. It seems to me for engineers that's actually pretty good news. But the point is that's going to create a lot of economic growth, and not just for engineers and not just for people in the electricity business, but the spin-off of that kind of reinvestment in the economy through rebuilding a lot of the infrastructure that we have let either slide, or in terms of electricity to some degree, people planned ahead. There seemed to be more money in those days, or there was less argument about how to spend it. And the power system, the grid that was built in the 50s and 60s, basically is now, it's physically exhausted in some places, but it really is up to capacity. And so people were thinking back in the 50s and 60s, we're not going to be a country of 14 million forever. And in fact, if we're going to keep growing, we're going to have this capacity, and we're going to have a power grid and a power generation system so that we can get to, well, actually where we are now, about double the size, a little more than double the size. So, but I'm just saying from the engineering profession alone, and I know you've done a paper on the electrical system, and I think that the Canadian Electricity Association is one of the people you may want to have as an ally as you are thinking about how to move your agenda forward. And I want to talk about that for a moment. If 80% of what you want to do is communication, then you have to think how to communicate, and you have to actually work at learning how to communicate. I always think that communication is a bit like real estate. We all want to sell our houses by ourselves so we can keep the commission, but the reality is that most of us, even when we try it, end up going to the real estate industry. And the reason there's a real estate industry is because it's a lot more complicated than it looks. You don't just stick a sign on your front lawn and then sort of hope that on Sunday afternoon people come by and wave checks in your face, and after a while you pick the highest one. Well, communicating is like that as well. You say, well, look, I mean, I can phone somebody, or I can tell somebody, or I'll send them a letter, I'll put out a paper, and you can. But by and large, it is like a pebble in the ocean. And the bigger the pebble, the more feedback there is, the more ripples you make. But basically, if you don't know how to communicate, you should engage people who do know how to communicate. And you communicate at the end of the day to get the government to do what you hope it will do. But bottom line is, governments really generally do, as Minister Murray was saying, they do what they think they have to do, and they have to do it because they think people want it, and more people want it than don't want it, so they do it. So basically, you have to communicate through the media, because the government does hear from people individually, and it's important to know how to approach the government with specific things that you want to do. But generally, people communicate through the media, first perhaps just to get an appointment with the government so that you can talk to a minister and say, this is what it is we want to do. And so I think you have to consider, well, how are we going to do that? Are we going to, as a group of engineers, and with our Center for Public Policy, are we going to become a conversationalist in the national conversation on a number of different issues? Or are we going to pick out one or two things that we think are important to us and hope that we can fight our way through the national conversation and get those things on the table? I think that basically a strategy works best when you do them both. And that sounds, in one level, contradictory, and another way, well, you know, if we're going to do them all, then you don't have, Newman, you don't have any idea of really what you're talking about. You says, well, just do it all and see what happens. I think that you have to do it in a focused way. You have to know on some things you can talk about as engineers that are part of the public conversation, but something on which you have credibility. And in fact, engineering is such a diverse field that if you want to get involved in any number of different things, you probably can, because somebody in your group, or many in your group, will be engineers in that specific thing. I was talking about electricity, but you could have it in aeronautics, you could have it in almost any part of engineering you think. But at the same time, if you're all over the map, you have to have some kind of priority. So let's think of something that you might want to get involved in. But then when you get involved in the public conversation, you have to understand you could be controversial. And if you could be controversial, I don't think engineers as a group particularly like to be controversial. I don't think it's, you know, lawyers, not all lawyers, but lawyers kind of like to be controversial. Sometimes it's even good for their practice to be controversial. But engineers do not strike me that way. But there's a very important issue that the governments have backed away from. But when you look at the whole innovation agenda and think about it, do you remember it was in the summer or the spring of 2009 that they called themselves the Big Five? 5 universities, Laval, McGill, U of T, University of Alberta, and BC, came forward with a proposal saying, look, innovation is incredibly important. Research is what leads to innovation, and we are the best at research in the country. And the federal government, through its ability to put money into post-secondary education should make the provinces where those universities are located, they should make us the research universities of the country. And don't worry too much. Maybe, I mean, obviously Waterloo has a research capacity. They weren't invited to take part, but obviously they would have a pretty good argument. But anyway, come to us, put the money here, and we'll generate the economic benefits. If you put them in the University of Saskatchewan, or you put them in Queens, or you put them in Guelph, you're not going to do that. It may be sort of democratic and fair, and Canadians want to be democratic and fair. And there was a big backlash, and the government dropped it because obviously, particularly the current government doesn't believe in elites, or it says it doesn't believe in elites. I kind of hope that there's a couple of elite people in the government, because otherwise, what kind of a government would you have, or what kind of anything would you have? Can you imagine having the national hockey team and not having any elites on the hockey team? I mean, the whole idea is silly. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that I would think the engineering profession might want to weigh in on. And basically, the university presidents were saying, if we could just have research students, PhD candidates, or people with PhDs that are doing research, and we could attract them from all around the world, which was part of the message as well, everything would be fine if we didn't have to have all those other darn students who were just, doing other stuff, and we could get them out of the way. Well, obviously, that's a very tough case to make, but it probably is in an economic and scientific way. In terms of driving innovation, it may be a very good idea. But that's the kind of thing that I would think engineers, if you're going to have a public profile, would be asked about. The media would phone you up and say, what do you think about that? Is that a good idea or not? And then you would have to think of all the places you'd graduated from, and you'd have to, some of you would probably think, well, that's a pretty smart idea, and others you would think, what a cuckoo idea that is, we can't possibly do that. So I think if you want to get into the debate, and I encourage you to get into the debate because I do think that you have a skill set that is important in the debate, but at the same time you have to be understanding that the debate is not just what you want it to be. There's a debate, and there's always another side, and another side, and in public life, and particularly in political life, there's always pushback, and you can't start the debate and then get out of it, because then the general public will think, well, they got out of it, I guess they didn't know what they were talking about, and we won't pay any attention to them anymore. So the other thing that you have to think about is, when you get into a public arena, who's going to do it? How are you going to move forward, and how are you going to have a presence in terms of the public debate? And really what you need to do is get amongst yourselves, or from the outside, if you feel that that would work better, you have to get a really good real estate agent. And a real estate agent, in terms of what you're doing, is you really need a good communicator. You need someone who understands your issues, who can take them so that you don't have to be an engineer to understand them, convince the public that they are at least worthy of consideration, and to carry them forward, probably so that they get into the media, but also that that person or your group of people, if you have enough people to do it, that person has a receptive audience with policymakers, whether it's provincially or federally. And the best example of that I can think of offhand, and he just gave up the job recently, is Tom DeQuino. I don't know if that name means much to you, but I see some people nodding. Tom DeQuino was a lawyer by training, and he was hired by what was then called the Business Council of National Issues, and he became the CEO of the CEOs, but he was basically, and I don't say this in a pejorative way, and he's a friend of mine, but he basically became their spokesman and lobbyist. And he became hugely successful, and if you went around Canada, certainly in his prime, and said, name me 5 important Canadian businessmen, his name would probably be mentioned. When in fact, he wasn't actually a businessman at all. He'd never been in business. I mean, he'd been sort of a consultant, and he'd been in a law firm for a little while, but he wasn't a businessman. But he was so good at taking the concerns of the business community, of boiling them down so you didn't have to be a businessman, and articulating them and moving them forward, that he could get the Prime Minister on the phone. He could get meetings with the Minister of Finance. He could get people to come to events, say like this one, from the Cabinet, and you're doing very well. You got Minister Murray, and that's the minister you want. So I congratulate you for doing that. But if you want to be part of the national debate, I think you have to be serious about it. You have to organize yourselves so you can carry it forward, and you have to have the people in place to do that for you. I think if you do that, you will be able to play an important role as engineers in the life of our country. Of course, I go back to my first point, only 4 elected out of 308. What is that? That's 25% of 4%, so that's not very much, is it? Now, you all studied math and I studied history, so you can work that out. But anyway, you take my point. That's not very many. The more of you that are there to hear the message when it's coming in, the more likely it's to be well received. So I would encourage you to think about public life and to be willing to take part in it. You can't all do it, but some of you should. And you don't have to make it, particularly when you have a career like engineering, you don't have to make it a lifetime job like a lot of people do in politics. And I think that if you organize yourselves properly, set your objectives, move forward as a group with a powerful message and a good spokesman, I think you will have an influence in our country, and I think it's important that you do have that influence, and so I urge you to move in that direction. Thank you.
We've got time for a couple questions if folks would like to come up. And please, no preamble, right to the question.
Okay, no problem. Stephen Lightfoot, I'm back. Okay, so I won't preamble very much.
No preamble, just questions. Let's go.
Okay, well, so lawyers, let's say many politicians, journalists lawyers and journalists become politicians because they're good communicators. Engineers typically don't. They're analytical people. So what is it about the engineer? Let's say it's a question about nature versus nurture. Do engineers, let's say the kind of people that go into engineering, are they analytical to begin with, and they're never trained in communication in engineering school, and therefore never become communicators, or is it something else? Like what's going on there, and why are lawyers good communicators and engineers aren't? That's the question.
Well, you see, journalists don't know how to do things technical, but engineers do. So your question was answered by that. No. Well, I think we tend to pursue the education that leads us to the career that we want, and so I think a lot of it is people following forward on the things they're interested in, and in engineering. Maybe communications isn't as important, but there's an awful lot of lawyers who can't communicate, and there's a lot of journalists who maybe can write but can't talk, and there are people who can talk but can't write, and and at some level, skills can be learned. Some people are naturals at it and do it better than others, but my sense is that engineers, and my stepfather was an engineer, so that's my real point of reference, but engineers are practical, and engineers like to identify a problem or set up a project, which is maybe not a problem, but it is in a sense how you're going to do it, work out how it can be accomplished, set out a plan for doing that, and usually there will be difficulties that were unforeseen that come up, but they will be within a kind of certain parameter, and they will work to resolve that, and then it's finished, and they go on to the next thing. Public life isn't like that. Take the issue, say, of healthcare as a problem. We all know that there's problems with healthcare. We all know we have a system that works not bad, considered what the alternatives might be, but we know that's going to have the changes in it are going to have to be addressed in the next few years. But there's any number of different people with any number of different interests beyond just the health of the population. They have their own economic interests tied up in it as well, who will have different views on how the system could be changed and improved, and each of them is a competing view, and they could be one as legitimate as another, and then you have to argue about it, and maybe you have to cut a deal, and you have to put water in your wine. It seems to me engineering projects, if you're building a dam, you don't want to put water in your wine because the dam doesn't work. And I just think in those ways, perhaps engineers don't find it as interesting a process. But by forming this group, you know, you realize that you've got something to say. You feel that what you want to say isn't being said, or if it's being said, it's not being heard. So obviously, just by taking these steps that you have, you want to be involved, and that's what I was congratulating you about. I think you have to be involved. Now you have to think how you're going to do it.
Great. Thank you very much. Cliff?
Actually, less of a question than a comment. I think it's important for me to note that I generated more notes from your speech than the other two speakers put together. People have to remember...
Do you Twitter? That would be helpful.
People have to remember the message that's coming out of this, and some of the takeaways I've got are we've shown up, we need to engage in the discussion, but we have to stay in the discussion. And what's very, very sensitive for us now is making sure that we remember that we're in the discussion as citizens, not lobbyists, because that's what will buy our credibility. And the other comment I wanted to make is on pacing. Yes, it's a good observation about the federal election, but the goal, and Howard will tell you, the goal is actually 11 in 2011, but that's provincially. And that's really our pacing, is to make the beachhead there. And then we can move onto the federal stage. But that's more an insight. And I just want to remind
well, thank you for that. And obviously, I mean, your association is provincially regulated. They are across the country, and in many ways, you know, I spent a lot of time in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. I covered provincial legislatures before I got here, and I worked in the States. But I always thought working in Ottawa was like being in the NHL, and being in the provincial legislatures was like being in the minors. But what I found now in my consulting work, and I still live in Ottawa, but as Howard said, I'm on the board of the Canadian Club in Toronto, because so much, I mean, Toronto's a big city to start with, but so much of also what is important really comes through the provincial legislature. That's more true now than it was 40 years ago, partly because of the way the federal government's decentralized, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the place you have to look first is the provinces. So 11 in 11. So what are 120 seats in? 107. 107. Okay, so that's not a bad average. Good. Thank you.
Very good. I'd really like to thank Don. Again, I think your ideas that you presented to the group and the challenges that you put forward to us on how to engage and how to get in there, very well put across and very insightful. So with that, if you could please join me in thanking Don for his remarks.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Well done. Much appreciated.